highlights the reading and the information that you guys are asked to look into. Gives you a lot more information than what I'm giving you, but I'm just going to kind of connect the events and hopefully make more sense. But all this information's on your website or in Canvas right here on Monday, April 13th, where it says directions for causes of the Civil War activity. So all you have to do is click on this and then first decide if you're going to make an infographic or a PowerPoint. And then this is your rubric. This is due this Friday. And then here is all your readings. So this is where you're going to find all your information. This is super important. And the video that I'm creating right now will go right here. Um, and then what I'll do is, um, this is all going to be on one video, but the video that I put here will be fast forwarded to the part where you need to watch it for this section. So we're going to start off by explaining the Fugitive Slave Act, the Compromise of 1850, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and just kind of showing the connection. And your job is to decide out of these first four things, what is the top two major causes of the Civil War based on your opinion. You can argue that any of them are. You just have to give a good argument. Okay? All right. So, some things that you guys are going to need to know, some vocab just for this part. And I might figure out how to do some vocab later on, but I think what I'm going to do is just teach you the vocab as we're learning it. And which would mean that we're going a little bit away from how we used to do vocab, but if I figure out something in the future, I'll do that. But for now, you need to know what secession is, because we're going to talk about the southern states seceding. You can think of it as just breaking away. So we were, right now we're 50 United States. If the South were to secede at this point, it'd be like, I don't know, 10 or 12 states breaking away from the rest of America, and then we would become two nations. And that's kind of what happened with the start of the Civil War. Popular sovereignty is just having the right to vote. It's going out and voting. That's what you're going to hear that a lot when you hear about Bleeding Kansas and things like that. But it's just really going and voting. They're just saying popular sovereignty. So we're going to start with talking about this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. When this book was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, she wrote a book exposing what slavery was really like, because there was a lot of people that heard of slavery and knew of slavery, but they might not have known what the life of a slave was like. So she wrote this book. It sold like wildfire. It went throughout the world. It became very popular. Um, and everybody was reading it. Everybody was talking about it. And discussing it. And the book was very effective in changing people's minds on slavery. So there's been things like this that have come out in popular culture before. Um, and people just these kinds of things sway their minds. So obviously the Southerners did not like this book. This book was banned in some areas because they felt like it was making everyone into abolitionists and everyone hates slavery, which they should have. Her book was effective in opening people's minds and thoughts. So at one point, she meets Lincoln, and Lincoln famously said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war," because she swayed so many people's minds. So anyway, we're going to start with talking about some laws. Everything was kind of kosher in the country for a while due to this imaginary line. You guys have probably heard of the Missouri Compromise line. So it used to be this agreement that basically all the territory up here would be free and everything below would be slave, because the big thing was we didn't want, or the South didn't want, the free states to overpower the southern states, because then that would take away their possible right of owning slaves. And so you'll hear people argue, is the Civil War a state rights issue or is it an issue over slavery? And that's something that we're going to bring up later. But the South was basically arguing that they had the right to own slaves within their states, and the North didn't really like that much. And so um, anyway, this imaginary line that they created um, kind of held out the war for a long time. But everything changes. So, in the Compromise of 1850, um, this is when we kind of open up to conflict, because when this compromise is done, this imaginary line that they used to have with the Missouri Compromise is kind of over. So that allows people to actually vote if they want slaves or not, and then everything that was kind of balanced on the surface just kind of erupts in fire. It's kind of like a tumultuous marriage, and then you take away that one thing that was holding it together, and that was that imaginary line. So the Missouri Compromise has three major things that come out of it. And if you watch the Hip Hughes thing, he goes in better explanation of this. But basically, California, this huge area over here, becomes a free state. So that's an agreement. And you can see with that imaginary line, California would have been split in half. So that's kind of a weird split. Then they also have the Fugitive Slave Act that comes out of this. This is probably one of the most atrocious parts of the Missouri Compromise of 1850, because now basically, no matter where you're at, even if you're in the North, and if you're African American, that you can get sold into slavery. So they also made it so, like, if you were a slave in the South and you escaped to the North, and let's say a white person saw, or it doesn't have to be a white person, just any person saw that you escaped to the North, um, and they knew that you escaped and they didn't report it, then that person would go to jail. So basically, if you knocked on my door and said, "Hey, I'm an escaped slave," and I didn't go report you, I would go to prison if they found that out, and I would be fined. And so it made escaped slaves have a much harder time escaping. And then also it was a big effect on free African Americans. So because that opens up the potential for them to get kidnapped and sold into slavery, which did happen. And then with popular sovereignty, we have, you guys probably learned about Bleeding Kansas last year. It opens up these territories into having these fanatics come in. So you guys have probably heard of border ruffians from Missouri, and the John Browns and all these crazy people will come into these states to try to sway their vote or to illegally vote to make them either free or slave territory. So this Fugitive Slave Act that I was just talking about, they this is kind of like a sign that you would have seen up at the time, um, and it just was this huge scare tactic within the Missouri Compromise. Um, so anyway, if you guys, I have it right here, and I'll move this. If you guys have ever seen this movie, 12 Years a Slave, this is in the PowerPoint if you guys are interested in watching it. It's a really good movie about this guy who was basically kidnapped and then sold into slavery, and he had a direct effect on his life because of the Fugitive Slave Act. So it's a good movie to watch, and it'll give you some background context to this time period. So, due to the Compromise of 1850, Kansas-Nebraska territory comes into power, or into play, basically. So this imaginary line would have made the Kansas and Nebraska territory free, but now we can vote if we want these areas to be free. And the southern states were really hoping that these areas would become slave states, and then the northern states were really hoping they would become free states. So that's why you do have the people coming in from Missouri and the John Browns and the crazies trying to get Kansas to be whatever they wanted it to be. And it causes a lot of death and all these kinds of things. So basically, the Missouri Compromise opens up a lot of issues in this country. But I think there were issues that needed to be dealt with. So this is not on your timeline of events, but it's a fun one. And if you want to choose it, you can. And this PowerPoint that I have right here is going to be below my video. So if you want to have access to this, you can click on it. But this is just a fun story. If you thought things were crazy now, they were definitely crazier back then. Because Charles Sumner, which is this guy in this picture, gives this like 2-day long speech um, talking about how terrible slavery is, and he makes fun of Preston Brooks's cousin. His cousin recently had a stroke, and he makes fun of how his speech is slurred, and just goes on and on. And so instead of having a shootout duel, he decides to go on the Senate floor and just kick his butt. And you guys can see, people watching fights and enjoying fights has been around for a long, long time. You all get out your cell phones and you laugh about it, but back then they were just watching and enjoying. So people have a long history of standing by and enjoying these kinds of fights. So if you do want to learn more about Charles Sumner or the Canyon of Charles Sumner, there's a video there for you. It's a interesting story, but this all comes because of Bleeding Kansas and the Kansas-Nebraska Act and all of this. So it all relates back to the Compromise of 1850. If this compromise wasn't done, you wouldn't have had Bleeding Kansas. You wouldn't have had John Brown. You wouldn't have had the Border Ruffians. You wouldn't have had the Fugitive Slave Act, and you wouldn't have had the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So anyway, it just kind of opens up this big thing. And the reason I have this picture is because back then it was pretty kind of crazy in the Senate and the House and even at the presidential level. And you guys might think politics are kind of crazy now. So I put a picture of Nancy Pelosi ripping up Trump's speech after he gave his State of the Union address. This was a diss, but it's a very light diss. She's not taking a cane and beating him over the head with it. And then Trump, he just tweeted this just on April 9th. So she's third in line for president, and they're just acting like children. So again, they're not beating each other yet, anyway. So then the Dred Scott case, this is one of America's really famous Supreme Court cases, and it's a stain in our history for sure. Dred Scott is from Missouri, Kansas, and he sues his owner for freedom. And he sued his owner for freedom because his owner was in the military and took Dred Scott into some states where slavery was not allowed. And Dred Scott learned that if you were a slave taken into these free territories and used as a slave, then you could obtain freedom. So he sued his owner for freedom. So anyway, it goes at the Missouri level. He actually, at first, and this is Dred Scott's wife. At first, he gains his freedom, and then it gets basically overturned, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And so what the outrage is at the Supreme Court is that he could not sue his owner because he was a slave. Even though Dred Scott had a good argument, our federal Supreme Court said that this case isn't valid because Dred Scott is not a human. He cannot sue his owner. So this is the first time at the national level where we're actually recognizing slavery as a legal thing and then saying slaves are not human, that they're property, that they're animals, basically. Before that, it wasn't cut and dry anywhere at the federal level. So this is why this is such a crazy ruling from the Supreme Court. The only good news about the Dred Scott case, and by the way, this case outraged abolitionists, it outraged America that we wouldn't grant freedom to a man who had a very valid argument and had the audacity to actually sue his owner and try to get his freedom legally. So the only silver lining on the Dred Scott story is he was eventually bought by Taylor Blow, who gave him his freedom. So even though he couldn't legally get freedom, Dred Scott obtained it at the very last year of his life. So he had 1 year of freedom, basically. And so if you guys ever go to St. Louis, Missouri, you can see his grave. And on the back of it, it says freed from slavery by his friend Taylor Blow. And then it has the information about the Dred Scott decision on the back. It says, subject to the decision of the Supreme Court of the United States in 1857, where he was denied citizenship to the Negro, voided the Missouri Compromise Act, became one of the events that resulted in the Civil War. So then you guys got John Brown, who becomes famous and leading Kansas and going to Pottawatomie in Kansas and killing 5 pro-slavery people. And the argument becomes, is this man a hero or a terrorist? In Kansas, we celebrate him, but there are many people who think, why do we celebrate this fanatic? He would like to have been known as the man who started the Civil War, but he attempted in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, to get the Civil War going, but he just was not able to do it. The slaves, for one, didn't trust him enough to just drop everything and go with him. Nat Turner was more successful in convincing slaves to uprise and fight back and kill against pro-slavery people than he was. But he sure as heck tried to bring the institution of slavery to an end. He spent his life fighting against it. And in the end, he was hung for it. So, or hanged is how you say it. So anyway, John Brown is definitely a cause of the Civil War, but he didn't actually cause the war. If anything caused the war, this is the straw that broke the camel's back. Lincoln comes into play and he gets elected in 1860. And he is actually the first Republican president. The first Democrat in office was Andrew Jackson. So the Republican Party in 1860 was new. It was a new political party. And it was known as an anti-slavery party at the very beginning of its existence. And Lincoln was a very moderate Republican, and he was also very much against slavery. But he did promise. He promised to keep slavery where it was, but he was not going to admit any new slave states. Which again, that comes back to the balancing issue, because the South wanted the free states in the North and the southern states and the South that allowed slaves to be equal in power. And Lincoln's just basically saying, you know what, slavery exists and I hate the institution and we're not adding any more states with slaves. So the southern states viewed this man as the man that was going to take away slavery once and for all. They did not believe him when he said that he wasn't going to get rid of the institution. So they did a very big not my president move and just split. And South Carolina actually became the beginning of the secession. So, and several states started to follow, and then we were 2 nations, and war at that point was inevitable because, as Lincoln famously said, a house divided cannot stand. And so we had our first and only Civil War. And it came down to the issue of slavery and should slavery exist. And so the war happened, and as a result of the North winning, slavery does come to an end. If you are wondering what these gray states are, they're called border states, these blue states are called border states. That means that they were pro-slave states. Missouri, the famous Dred Scott state, um, they're pro-slavery, but they stayed with the North, actually. So Missouri wanted to stay with the North, and we'll kind of explain that later. And then these gray states are just states that seceded after the start of the Civil War. These states down here were the ones that went away before the war officially began. They were just immediately followed South Carolina's reaction. So now what you guys are going to do in this next part of it is decide, was the Dred Scott case John Brown, the election of Lincoln, or the secession of the South, the next top two causes of the Civil War. It's up to you. Any of these are good arguments, they're all good cases. But I do encourage you guys to read and understand the information because next week you guys will have like a little open notes quiz because I want to make sure that you guys read through all of the information and we'll go from there. So please do good this week and I hope you learn a lot. Goodbye.